sure we've all had the experience, probably when we were much younger, but some of us, even more recently, of having somebody force upon us something that they tell us is good for us. Remember that foul-tasting medicine that was going to make us better? Or those icky vegetables that nobody wanted to eat, but we were told they were good for us? So many experiences as we're growing up are based on that. This is going to be good for you. My own confession is that that's sometimes how I approach Lent. I'd never reach for that icky medicine on my own. I'd never reach for those terrible tasting vegetables, although some that I hated as a kid I now like. But that stuff that's good for us that we don't really want. Doesn't matter how early or how late Lent comes on the calendar. It doesn't matter if it's in the midst of a snowstorm and low temperatures, or if when the nature is bursting with signs of spring, it always comes too early. We just had Christmas, didn't we? And especially this year, remembering that we entered into this pandemic, we started covering our faces, we started doing all this social distancing, we started going through gallons of hand sanitizer and all that stuff during Lent of last year. And even though we got through all of Holy Weekend, Easter, and then summer, and then fall, and then Advent, and then Christmas, in the midst of this pandemic, it still seems like we're back where we started. The Lent that was interrupted last year as everything shut down. So if I'm dragging my feet about Lent this year, I suspect I'm not the only one. And if I'm dragging my feet about Lent this year, I really need to hear those words from St. Paul in that second reading, now's the time. Now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. Because if we think about it, most of us, I think, have cut ourselves some slack during the pandemic. Don't you think? Spent more time watching stuff instead of doing stuff. Spent more time filling our faces with food that we really didn't necessarily need. Got into some habits that might be harder to get out of whenever a new normal appears. The discipline that is so much a part of our tradition and so necessary for the season of Lent because it's necessary for the whole Christian life is something like that medicine or those vegetables that we just don't accept readily, eagerly, with willingness. But probably we should. Because we hear the attitude of God in the scriptures today. God is rich in mercy and compassion. God is slow to anger. God is indulgent with his compassion. That's what Joel tells us when he's gathering the whole assembly. Our common feature is that we're not like God. Our common feature is that we're not so generous. Our common feature is that we're pretty stingy with some of these basic virtues. And we're not merciful and kind and loving as we should be. We've certainly seen that collectively over the last several months. Nobody can deny that with all of the division in our country and that has found its way into the church, that has flourished because so many people are online rather than thinking and reading and praying and reflecting and doing the things that make us better persons, we give into such negativity. And we're not kind and merciful. So maybe that's what we need to hear from St. Paul. Not only is this the acceptable time, and now it's about time to start cleaning that up, he reminds us that we're sent as ambassadors for Christ. Whether that's on the UK campus, whether that's in our homes, in our families, or at the workplace, we're sent as ambassadors for Christ, his representatives. And as an ambassador in the political world, you know you got to think like the person that you represent. And even if you have personal disagreements, and even if you have trouble with some of the thoughts and some of the positions and whatever it is, an ambassador represents someone higher, someone more powerful, someone more influential, and those who are sent in that person's name carry that responsibility to do so faithfully. Lent reminds us of that year-long responsibility that we have, of that day in and day out responsibility that we have to be ambassadors for Christ, to represent his attitude, to represent his thoughts, to represent his values, to represent his way of thinking, to represent his kindness, his love, his compassion, and his mercy, to build up the very kingdom that he came to announce and brings about through his selfless love that leads to his death and resurrection. Ambassadors for Christ, working for reconciliation. I don't know much that our world, our country, our church, our community, our town, our city, our neighborhood needs more than that right now. Working for healing in every sense of the kind of healing that we need. Now is the acceptable time, and now is the day of salvation. And so in the gospel, Jesus gives us the very traditional practices that were imported directly and straightly from Judaism, that were lived by the first generation of disciples and have been proposed in and out of popularity, in and out of season, down through the centuries: prayer, fasting, and abstinence. That's where the medicine comes in. That's where the vegetables come in. Prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Prayer, fasting, and almsgiving is what we're about these days, to make us more Christ-like. They're not ends in themselves. As Jesus told his disciples in the gospel, they're not to make you heroes. It's not an endurance test. It's not to make you seem holier and appear that way to the rest of the world. Those are inner practices that make us more like Christ, whom we are called to represent. The best advice about prayer is the advice that St. Benedict gave his monks 1,000-some years ago when he said, Lent is about doing what you're always supposed to do, just do it better. Well, who among us couldn't make more time for prayer? Who among us couldn't do better at our prayer life? Who among us couldn't make more time for listening to God's voice? Who among us couldn't make an effort to bring our needs to God before we try to figure it all out on our own? Prayer is a hallmark of the Christian life, both our public prayer as we gather here today and the private prayer that we do in the secret recesses of our heart, in our home, that only God sees. Make it better. It's more about quality than quantity, but quantity is important too if we've neglected it. If Netflix is easier to spend hours on than it is to find a couple minutes for prayer. And fasting goes hand in hand with our prayer. And that's the part in our consumerist society that's so difficult for us. We like to consume. We like to fill ourselves with that which ultimately doesn't fill us at all. And most of us, myself included, in this culture, consume more calories than we need, consume more rich things than we need, and could do with less. We could use the discipline that is engaged in eating less. But I think we consume something much more dangerous. I think we consume a lot of thoughtless, mindless, violent, ugly words through the social media that we engage. I think we're too quick to look to self-appointed authorities than the ones that God has ordained and put forward for our teaching. We consume junk, whether it comes in snack chips, or whether it comes through tweets, or whether it comes through Instagram or any other means of social media. Fasting can be more than about food. Fasting is stripping away that which isn't good for us, moderating our consumption so that we might recognize a true hunger, the hunger that exists for God. And that prayer and that fasting are meant to lead to almsgiving, a traditional word for charity, a traditional word for helping others, giving stuff away that is superfluous, that is abundant, or in the higher, more highly virtuous, giving away even that which we need. As Jesus gives us his very self, every time we celebrate Mass, he gives it all to us, the model for charity, the model for almsgiving, the model for what our Lenten sacrifices should lead to. We're given rice bowls, a beautiful way to remember those three practices together, to pray for people in the world that are starving, who don't have the luxury or the option to eat less because they're trying to survive. We learn about them and pray for them and sacrifice for their benefit. Maybe our sacrifices and our fasting from excessive use of social media could also help to contributing to a kinder and gentler and more peaceful, more tolerant, more loving, and more listening world. Because disciples are supposed to be, in the first place, listeners before speakers. And so, by the way, are the best teachers. We enter this Lent at an unusual time. And ready or not, here it is. Now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. And this Lent is not an end in itself. It's a preparation. It's a time of getting ready. It leads us to something greater. And that is to celebrate deeply the transformation of life that Jesus offers us, that Jesus models for us by laying down his life and taking it up again. That we celebrate with our brothers and sisters who are choosing this way of life and asking to be reborn in baptism, and opted for again by each of us who choose at Easter to renew our baptismal promises and profess as ambassadors for Christ the hope of a new world renewed by the death and resurrection of Jesus, life in abundance and life without end that he offers us. May your journey be blessed. May your journey be transformative. May your journey give you a greater sense of peace and identity as an ambassador and disciple of Jesus.